This is one of the classrooms that I studied in college. And at the time, I was wrestling with whether or not to believe in God. I didn't feel that I could take a blind leap of faith. I was studying philosophy. And thankfully, as we heard last week, that is not at all what Christianity is asking of us. Faith and reason are not opposed, but actually they're necessary for one another. Today, we're going to begin looking at worldviews other than Christianity. We're first going to start with atheism, the view that there is no God. And actually, that's a view that both Ravi and I were attracted to at different points in our lives, and Ravi will tell you a bit about how that played out in his life. Then we're going to look at a related worldview, scientism, the view that science explains everything. You may have heard someone say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. We used to need God to explain rain and rainbows and shooting stars, but now science can explain these things, and so we no longer need God. We're actually going to argue that not only does science not disprove God, but that actually only God proves science. Finally, we're going to ask the question of whether atheism and scientism can actually creep into the Christian life. Jesus asks us to look first to our own faults before we look to the faults of others. Is it the case that in some ways we sometimes live as practical atheists? I hope you'll find this session both a great encouragement and a challenge. I hope it'll be a great blessing to you as you look to know God more deeply and to share Him more effectively with others. Ravi, I'm looking forward to discussing these next two topics with you. We have atheism, the idea that there is no God, and then we have scientism, the idea that science explains everything or can explain everything, and therefore there's no need for a God. And these are particularly prevalent and I think increasingly prevalent ideas in our culture. The number of atheists in our country of America has doubled in a short span of time. And so these are important topics for us to deal with. They're also personal topics. So as a teenager, you found yourself with a leaning towards atheism. What was attractive about that way of seeing the world to you?
You know, I guess, Vince, it's more clear when you look back than when you're going through it. I had no interest in any religion, really. The best way to describe it would be almost non-theistic. I didn't view God as an important entity in life, except at examination time. You know, you'd cry out to prayer to whoever it was out there, which is interesting because almost all of my friends were either Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, or Sikh. I had no Christian friends that would talk to me about Christ. I cannot recall a single conversation in all my years up till about my 16th year ever talking about who Jesus was and what the gospel message was about, not even really asking the question. So I lived as if there were no God, and you have to be the determiner of your destiny. It was only, I think, when I came to that bed of suicide struggle, when I started asking the question, what is my life really about? What does it amount to? Am I here by accident? Am I here by design? And that question is pivotal for understanding life. Are you the random product of time plus matter plus chance? Or are you here by design and for a purpose with a loving God who places value upon you as an individual? They are two diametrically opposite conclusions, and the entailments of those choices are huge.
Wow. Yeah, one of the quotations by Nietzsche that I've always resonated with is this idea, if there were gods, how could I bear not to be a god? That's something I think was true of me. I wanted to control my own life. And like you said, reflecting back, it's a lot clearer than at the time. But I think I was afraid of forgiveness. I was afraid of needing forgiveness. I was someone who would never ask for forgiveness. And I was philosophically minded enough that I could always sort of rationalize and argue my way into not being the one who had done wrong. And just the idea of grace, the idea that you could need forgiveness and yet be freely forgiven in an unconditional way, I just didn't have a sense that that could be true or a reality. And so I was afraid of needing forgiveness. I was afraid of being a sinner. And so the best way to deal with that was to be your own God and not have anyone else who you needed to answer to.
I find that fascinating, isn't it? As you and I have known each other now for these few years, the issue of forgiveness, the issue of grace. I never thought in those categories because you grow up in a culture like India where pragmatism and manipulating reality, you use people as an ends to means. And any Indian will tell you, you grow up in a very corrupt culture. You buy your way through any conflict and struggle. But the idea of forgiveness and grace and all was not a vertical issue, it was a horizontal issue. Oh boy, I wronged my friend, will he forgive me,
Yes.
you know? Or will he have the grace to be kinder to me? I would think more of grace in my examinations. You know, I've not done well. I hope my teacher will have a lot of grace and will forgive me for not studying. But I had a ruthless father, a tough father. Now, he had reason to be tough on me. And when I would bungle things, I would ask myself, will my dad really forgive me, or am I going to be in trouble? All of those are microcosmic expressions of really a macrocosmic world.
Yeah.
We are dealing with the created order and God himself.
That's great. One thing I often find in conversations with atheists is this idea of the burden of proof comes up. And sometimes an atheist wants to say, well, look, I'm not making a claim here. You're the one who's claiming there's this supernatural, invisible being. I'm not making a claim. I'm just saying that there's no God. I'm just not affirming that claim. And so the onus of evidence, the onus of the proof is on the theist rather than the atheist. This is something I've given a lot of thought to. And one phrase that I've found really helpful recently is the idea that criticism without alternative is empty. And even to just take a very simple analogy, if somebody says, you know, Vince, you've written a terrible book. Hopefully no one's saying that. But if someone says that, I might respond and say, okay, well, which books do you prefer? And if no one can name me, if the person can't name me a single book that they think is better than the book that I've written, well, then there's not much weight to their critique. And so sometimes I think the atheist worldview is wanting to critique without offering any alternative in place of the critique. And one thing which showed this to me, when I was an undergraduate studying philosophy, I wound up in a back and forth with a professor of the history of science at Princeton. And I was increasingly convinced of the Christian worldview, and he was an atheist, and we were having email exchanges back and forth. And at one point in one of the emails, he tried to make me feel silly or crazy for believing in a virgin birth. And initially, I started to write back about why maybe someone could rationally believe in a virgin birth. And then I realized, wait a minute, as an atheist, he believes in a virgin birth too. He believes in the virgin birth of the entire universe. Stephen Hawking, the Cambridge physicist, believes that the universe created itself out of nothing. Quentin Smith, very respected philosopher in his field, an atheist, he says we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. So I started to think this through, and I thought, wow, I'm not the only one as a Christian who believes in the virgin birth. I believe in the virgin birth of Jesus. Actually, everyone believes in a virgin birth, whether the virgin birth of Jesus or the virgin birth of an entire universe. So I started to realize I can ask some questions back as well. We go back to those ideas of origin, meaning, morality, destiny. If someone doesn't like the Christian way of explaining those things, it's fair, I think, for me to respond and say, okay, well, what's your way of explaining that, if not the Christian way?
I think that's brilliant. And the fact of the matter is, how does consciousness come from non-consciousness? How does something come from nothing? How does moral reasoning come from an amoral or non-moral starting point? But when an atheist really says there is no God, that they have no burden of proof, they have numerous proofs that they have to now come up with for assumptions that negation actually brings with it.
Right.
So when you say, I don't have to prove anything when there is no God, now you have to prove that life is purposeful. Now you have to prove that life has meaning. Now you have to prove that either there are moral absolutes or that there are none. It is bringing in a cartload of questions by the negation of an ultimate cause for life itself. They can't get away that easily. They like to think that all I'm saying is, I don't believe God exists. The burden of proof is on you. with God, I can answer numerous questions. Without God, most of their fundamental questions are unanswerable. That's why Chesterton puts it in a very unique way. He says, for the atheist, sorrow is fundamental, joy is peripheral. For the follower of Jesus Christ, joy is central and sorrow is peripheral. What do they mean by that? For the Christian, the fundamental questions are answered, and therefore the peripheral questions are not answered, and their sorrow becomes peripheral. For the atheist, the fundamental questions are unanswered, therefore sorrow becomes central, and only the peripheral questions are answered, and therefore joy becomes very peripheral for them. They have tiny little purposes with no ultimate purpose. They have tiny little meanings with no ultimate meaning. They have tiny little loves with no ultimate love. They have tiny little moralities with no ultimate morality. So the cartload of unanswered questions comes with a simple negation, which philosophically is unprovable. Anyway, you cannot prove an absolute negative. Not only that, in your field of science, now they have to go to explain things that they will never be able to explain in any other way. Yes. Everything that comes into effect has a cause. And so your struggle with science and your answer in science, I think that section is brilliant the way you deal with that. It helped me a lot just to go over that.
Well, one of the things that I work through there is that science is not only compatible with the existence of God, but it actually points to the existence of God. And so I love talking about this topic because I feel like the idea that science disproves God is just such an unfounded rumor. I mean, just to give two of really the most significant scientific discoveries of the last 100 years. One, that the universe has a beginning. Now, the Bible has claimed that for thousands of years, right at the beginning of the Bible, in the beginning. Science has come more recently to realize that the universe has a beginning. And if that's the case, if there was a change from there not being a universe to there being a universe, what accounts for that change? Well, it would have to be something which is outside of space and time, because it would have created space and time. It would have to be something which was highly intelligent, highly powerful, highly creative to create all of this. And so what would fit well as an explanation for the fact that the universe began to exist? I think that God is a fantastic explanation for that. And then we move on not just to the beginning of the universe, but to the fact that the universe is incredibly designed. Philosophers talk about it being finely tuned for life. And what they mean by that is that if the parameters of the universe had not been precisely the way they are, no life would have been possible. Not just our form of life, not just here on the planet Earth, but any form of life anywhere in the universe. One Cambridge astronomer says that the probability on chance alone, on atheistic assumptions, would be like a tornado blowing through a junkyard and just by chance producing a perfect Boeing 747 airplane. One Oxford physicist, he says that the probability on chance is 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. And if I were to try to write that out as a percentage, I couldn't do it because even if I could change all of the matter in the universe into paper, I would still have far too little paper to write the required number of zeros. Those are the sort of chances that we're talking about. But again, you have to ask the question, what if God exists? Well, then those probabilities change drastically. Why? Well, because the person in charge of creating the universe desired to bring life into existence and desired to call that life into relationship with himself. I'm reminded of an interview I saw with Richard Dawkins. This really blew me away. And at one point he said it's a very interesting hypothesis, the idea of life being planted here, seeded here by other intelligent beings somewhere else in the universe. And I couldn't believe that he said that. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, Richard Dawkins, the most famous atheist in the world, he's not actually against intelligent design. He just has a specific bias against divine design.
By saying there is no God, they've got a baggage load of unanswered questions. So now they've got spaceships bringing spores or coming from another planet because they hit the wall of irrationalism by talking about the fact that we just happen to be here by accident. The logical and the sublime theory that life has value, that life is sacred, that love is a legitimate pursuit, that relationships are meaningful. All of these have points of reference when there is a first cause of a personal being. And you take that personal being out of the picture, there goes the essential value and worth and so on. And your comment about, the universe having a beginning and the fine-tuning of the universe, once you move to the chemistry authorities on this, it becomes even more complex. Yes. You try to explain away the logical reality, and you move into a lot of illogical terrain and the quicksand of explanations. You sink lower and lower till your fundamental questions remain unanswered.
I think it was Hoyle who admitted that he was slow to come to believe that the universe had a beginning precisely because it cohered so well with the Bible.
That's right,
Is that right?
And then, of course, I'm trying to remember the director of Robert Jastrow, the director of the Goddard Institute for Space years ago in his book, God and the Astronomers, as Hoyle was an astronomer too. Robert Jastrow in his book makes the comment, he said, for the skeptic who has lived by the power of his own reason, it all ends like a terrible dream as they climb higher and higher up the mountains of knowledge, and they scale right to the top, and they're greeted by a band of theologians who've already been waiting there for centuries. So it's sort of like, why didn't I see it? Is it my pride that kept me from seeing the obvious?
Absolutely. And just one other feature, scientific feature of the universe, the regularity of the universe. This is something we just absolutely take it for granted every day, that the universe is going to continue in the ordered patterns tomorrow that it always has. But you might ask the question, why? Why is it so regular? Why is it coherent? And somebody might say, well, that's the way it's always been. But that's not an answer to the question. That is the question. Why has it always been that way? Why is it going to be that way tomorrow? There are an infinite number of different strengths that gravity could take. Why do we assume that tomorrow it's going to take the same strength that it has today and every day in the past? I actually don't think the atheist has an answer to that question. Now, if you have a God, you have an answer to that question because he desires the regularity, because he desires for us to live meaningful and coherent lives. And so I've actually come to think that even the regularity of the universe, which undergirds the entire scientific enterprise because you need a patterned universe in order to do science, that only makes sense if God exists. And so not only does science not disprove God, but I think actually only God proves science.
It was Darwin who talked about the fact that the very fact that you can have faith in your reason is a mind-blowing concept. Are you truly living by faith or by reason? Are you not having faith in logic as well? So to the non-theist or the skeptic, I really say they're the ones who are the believers of the God of the gaps. They've got too many gaps and end up positing something to fill that gap because they started from a negation of the only rational explanation for life, meaning, and ultimate reality.
That's good. I think of Einstein as well. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. I want to talk a bit about morality as well. Increasingly, it seems like we're having moral arguments against God. Whether that's arguments like the problem of evil, we couldn't have a loving God if there's so much suffering, whether that's arguments against Christian ethics that are now seen as intolerant or exclusive, whether that's arguments based in the Old Testament. Everyone now can just take out their smartphone and Google worst verses in the Bible and get a bunch of verses completely out of context. I like what you said at Google headquarters when we were there about a month ago. He said, just because you have a smartphone doesn't mean that you have a wise phone. That was fantastic. How do you respond to these moral arguments against God? I mean, isn't God actually what undergirds morality in the first place? How can we respond to those types of arguments?
I think it's a self-defeating argument that Richard Dawkins raises, describing God as malevolent and this and hateful and misogynistic and all this series of phrases that he gives. My question to him is, if God doesn't exist, you're really talking about us and you and me. And what's wrong with that?
Yes.
He's positing all these horrible things that God has done if God doesn't exist for him. So it's not God who's done that, it's humanity who's done that. And if there is no God, what's wrong with that? That's who we are, and that's the way we are, in Dawkins' own words, dancing to our DNA. But I put it in a simple argument like this. And the argument runs this way. When you talk about evil, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume there's a moral law. to differentiate between good and evil. So you say there's evil, you assume good. If you assume good, there's a moral law by which you differentiate between good and evil. And if you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver, but that's whom they're trying to disprove and not prove. There's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is the question? Now, somebody can stop me and say, wait a minute, Ravi, I follow you 3/4 of the way through. All right, let's assume there is a moral law. Why do you need a moral lawgiver, they will say. And the answer to that is very plain. You need a moral lawgiver because every question about evil is either raised by a person or about a person, which means the question assumes intrinsic worth for personhood, and you cannot assume intrinsic worth for personhood unless there is a personal moral first cause for creation. So the problem of evil is a very real question, but only tells you there are no answers outside from positing God himself as the originator of life, and then you find his answers to this. Otherwise, you raise the question that is meaningless in your own assumptions, but meaningful in your attacks.
That's fantastic. Immanuel Kant said that two things fill the mind with awe: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. And that's what we've been talking about. I think sometimes, even as Christians, we underestimate and we fail to consistently just be in awe of what God has created. I mean, right now, we're sitting here, we're rotating at 1,000 miles an hour. We're flying around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour. We're part of a galaxy being hurled through the universe at over 1,000,000 miles an hour with laws so orderly that human life exists. And so often we just walk through life as if this is normal and could just be explained away in naturalistic terms. That's absolutely remarkable. And just as we close this week 2 session, just wanted to note that two passages that I think are really significant. Romans 1:18-20, and it talks about how it's through creation that God has been revealing himself to people, to each person. And the word that's used there for what has been made is poema, where we get our English word poem from. And then in Ephesians 2, it talks about us as God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus for good works. And again, the word there is poema. So the two times that word poem is used in the Bible, it's used to talk about God's creation and it's used to talk about humankind. And so maybe as we reflect here on the intricacy and the design and the purpose of God's creation, that'll also help us to remember just how intricate and designed God's purpose for each one of us is as well.
All you need to do is hold a little baby in your arms and you see the poetry of God. How fearfully and wonderfully made a tiny little child is. It is only ultimate hubris who try to explain away the obvious.
Such an encouragement. Thank you for talking. I look forward to the next session.
To chat with you, Vince. Thank you.